In some specific food products, yeast is a crucial ingredient more often than not. It is also an amusing word to repeat over and over, as well as write poetry about. But we're not here to talk about art. We're here to talk about money. What does yeast cost, and why does it cost that much? First, some background info. What is yeast? Yeasts are single-celled microorganisms of the fungi kingdom, naturally found in nature all around us. They are extraordinary because they have this superpower called fermentation, in which they digest sugars and convert them into carbon dioxide and alcohol. Humans have been utilizing this for thousands of years. The main use of yeast is making dough rise by trapping CO2 inside the loaf, creating the oh-so-consumable and versatile substance known as bread. Yeast is also used to make alcoholic drinks like beer and wine, as well as low-alcohol content drinks like root beer. It influences the flavor of all these products depending on which of the thousands of types of yeast is being used. Obviously, it's a pretty hefty number of yeast types, so let's just pick a readily accessible one, like, say, instant yeast, used in baking. For the sake of time, of course.
Instant yeast is yeast ready for use once the package is opened and acts quicker in comparison to the alternatives, such as active dry yeast. Now let's look at the price. One basic brand of instant yeast is SAF Instant Red Yeast, priced at $7.95 per pound or about $1.75 per 100 grams. The price of yeast varies between brands, but simply choosing a basic, common one should be reasonable.
But how did it come to this? Why does it cost this much for yeast of all things?
Well, yeast is not manufactured, per se, but commercial yeast is produced in industrial plants. Here, 1 gram of yeast can be turned into 1 kilo in 48 hours, and then 13 tons in another 48 hours. In fermenters, molasses is fed to the yeast cells, making them multiply and spreading like the plague until sugar is fully consumed. The yeast cells used are selected from a bank of specially produced starter cultures, which are entirely different strains and may not be bred at the same location. After the yeast is produced, it must be transported and distributed for other companies to use, or just sold as it is. Now, we're interested in a certain form of yeast. The steps mentioned before are the steps needed to make liquid or cream yeast. Instant yeast, however, is a type of dry yeast, meaning there are extra steps to its production and packaging. In order to make dry yeast, the cream yeast that we got earlier passes through rotary filters, or vacuum filters, which suck away liquid, producing a fine layer of yeast. Then it is compressed, cut, dried, and then packaged according to what the orders specify. Yes, it is dried again, because they need to do that. For yeast intended to be sold commercially, all it has to go through after all this production is being transported and distributed to grocery store shelves, ready to be picked up by an everyday person. Hopefully.
The effort and infrastructure management required for production is the reason it costs what it does. Like all other products, manufactured or not, inflation has reared its ugly head on the yeast industry, but it hasn't affected it too much. Yeast can be made without the cheap labor and workers that other products have the luxury of exploiting, so it is in a higher cost bracket compared to other primary ingredients. When all is said and done, the price remains reasonable.
Yeast, the main perpetrator of inflation. Only about $8 a pound if you're into that.